Going to turn our attention to same-sex sexuality and begin with some history. But before doing so, I thought it might help, this was a last-minute sort of thing, to have some definitions that might help you along, not just tonight, but as you look at this issue in general. So if you look at your definitions sheet, we'll go over those. So first there's the term sexual identity. And that's the term used to refer to the objective categorization of a person's physiological status as male or female. In other words, penis, production of sperm versus vagina, creation of eggs. So that's sexual identity, sexual identity. It's physiological. Yeah. Then there's gender identity. And these, at one time, people only spoke of sexual identity. But it's been realized that there's a difference between sex and gender. Gender is related to the identification with the behavioral, cultural, or psychological traits typically associated with one's sex in a given society. So, for example, in our society, we usually look as the male as aggressive, female as passive, male as domineering, female as compassionate. So your gender is what you identify with there. If you identify more with the compassionate side, if you identify more with what are traditionally called female traits, that's your gender. Now what's interesting, and you might notice that this varies from society to society. What is considered masculine in one society might be feminine in another. So that's a relative term. But the key to note here is that the difference between sexual identity and gender identity. Sexual identity is purely physiological. Gender identity is more subjective. That becomes important when people feel divided. So, then there's the term sexual orientation. It's a term used to refer to a person's preference for either the same or an opposite sex partner. That's your sexual preference. Okay, heterosexuals, preference for the opposite sex. Gay, relating or having orientation to persons of the same sex. Lesbian, a gay term that applies to females. Bisexual, attraction to persons of both the opposite and the same sex. And now we come up with a term which is fairly relatively new, but it's been in the news a lot over the last decade, transgender. And this is why it's important to recognize the difference between sexual identity and gender identity. Transgender people are those who experience a mismatch between their sexual identity and their gender identity. So, for example, a person with female physiological apparatus may identify with male traits, behaviors, and attitudes. So they're not matching. Their sexual identity isn't matching with how they feel. So you've probably seen, I feel female, although I have a male body. You've probably seen that on the news, or vice versa. That's transgender. Okay? Transsexual are people who do something about that. In other words, they change their physiological structure to match how they feel inside. This is generally done with hormone treatment or surgical treatment. So transsexual are transgender people who have decided to make a physiological change. You've probably heard the word queer. When I was growing up, queer was just a general term for homosexuality. And it was, of course, a negative term, queer. But a number of gay people have taken this on as sort of a self-affirming umbrella where you take a negative term that another group uses for you and you make it positive. Like Methodists, our minister says. Where you find this is in the black community. The word that whites can't use is used all the time by blacks to each other. I know, I taught in a black school. You know, so in Vallejo, it was 50% black. The kids would always call each other, well, nigga, you know. Whites couldn't use that term unless they were given permission. And that was an interesting dynamic that was going on with kids there. But that term, queer, is, like many blacks use the N-word as an affirmation. That's done by many gay people. Then there, and that's where you get LBGTQIA, lesbian, bisexual, gay, transsexual, queer for the Q. What's the I and the A? I is intersex. And that's a term used for a variety of conditions in which a person is born with reproductive or sexual anatomy that doesn't fit with the typical definitions of that anatomy. For example, there's something called a micropenis in a baby boy, something that is so small that it's virtually unusable. Well, traditionally, who determined gender at birth, you know? The doctor. The doctor. So people who are intersex often have their equipment is not quite right, and then the question is, who am I? In India, there's a group called the Hijra. Many of them are intersex people. And at birth, they're usually said to be male, but over time, they desire to be female. So many of them have operations, etc., just like transgender people do today. And finally, what's the A at the end? IA. Asexual. Asexual. A lack of sexual attraction to anyone. So that's the whole realm there. I will mention some of these. We're basically today going to deal with same-sex sexuality. But these are good to know, especially if you're watching the news these days and these terms come up. You'll know what they mean. Okay, so let's do a little bit of history in terms of same-sex sexuality. Social attitudes towards same-sex relationships have varied over time and place. And tonight we're going to focus on Western history, and I want to begin with ancient Greece. The most widespread and socially significant form of same-sex relations in ancient Greece was between adult men and pubescent or adolescent boys. The term for that is known as pederasty. Pederasty, sorry. Greeks, now this is interesting. It shows how societies are different. Greek society did not distinguish sexual desire or behavior by gender. We tend to think that's automatic. But rather by the role that each participant played in the sex act. Active penetrator or passive penetrated. That was your main category, not male, female. Now that seems very different, right? And it is. But it shows that there are culturally different approaches to sexuality. The active or penetrative role was associated with masculinity and adulthood. The passive role with femininity and youth. Now, this relationship involved an older male, an adolescent youth, and a boy was considered adolescent until he grew a full beard, And in Athens, the older man was known as the Erastes. His role was to educate, protect, love, and provide a role model for his youth or his eromenos. If you've ever read Plato and Socrates, this was a highly idealized relationship. Not always what we would call sexual, but wasn't seen to be problematic if it was, because there was supposed to be a bond here. This wasn't just something that was done for sexual enjoyment. We might find that hard to relate to, but that was one of the major concepts. To love a boy below the age of 12 was inappropriate. So it was generally your adolescent youth, and you had this older man who would act as their sort of mentor, as it were. And it wasn't just sexual. It was meant to be a quote unquote love, educational, mentor relationship. At the age of manhood, the Greek youth were expected to reverse their role. They were no longer to be the penetrated, if that took place. Now they become the adult role, the masculine role, the penetrator. Males who engaged in what is passive homosexuality after the age of manhood were looked down upon. So it's kind of hard to sort of gather all this because it's so different from what we normally think of. But like I said, Socrates, Plato, many of the great philosophers found no problem with it. It wasn't seen to be exploitative. It was consensual, and it had a role within a larger sexual framework. Another interesting thing about Greek homosexuality, it was also found in the Greek military. We tend to think of military as masculine, right? Greek military, it was masculine, but there was a lot of homosexuality. Sexual love between soldiers was used to build their fighting spirit. You're more likely to die for someone you have a deep love relationship with, including sexual, they thought, than just somebody who you know from training. So this was a bond. In fact, there was a group called the Sacred Band of Thebes. It was a group of 150 pairs of male lovers which formed the elite fighting force in the Theban army. Then there's also numerous references in Greek mythology or in the epics. I don't know how many of you have read the Iliad, but there is the great Greek warrior Achilles. Achilles is the hero of all heroes, the warrior of all warriors, indestructible, da-da-da. But he has a very, very close relationship with another warrior by the name of Patroclus. Very close. And when Patroclus is killed by the Trojan top warrior Hector, Achilles won't fight. He is so down-stricken and in mourning about Patroclus being killed. So it's interesting to note that this notion sometimes we have of masculinity, femininity, it varies culturally. Achilles, you wouldn't want to fight Achilles, but he was also at least bisexual. Okay? And so it's good to read. Now, what about females in ancient Greece? Not much recorded, but there's speculation that there was probably a similar sort of relationship between adult women and young girls. We do have one figure that we can draw on. She's a famous poet. Her name is Sappho, S-A-P-P-H-O, 630 to 570 BCE. She was from the island of Lesbos. That's where we get lesbian. She was from the island of Lesbos. She wrote many love poems to females, 12,000 lines addressed to women and girls. We only have about 600 of these. She also had a school that she ran. So you can see this relationship with education and a deep relationship with the youth, also on the feminine side. So there was a community, and these girls often experienced homosexual or lesbian love. Here's an example of one of her poems that we have, and it's called To My Maiden Friends. This is my song of maidens dear to me. Erana, a slight girl I counted thee, when first I looked upon thy form and face, slim as a reed and all devoid of grace. But stately stature, grace, and beauty came unto thee with the years, O dost not shame. For this, Erana, thy pride hath grown. Therewith, alas for thee, I have not known one beauty ever more scornful mien or demeanor, although thou wert of all earth's daughters queen. Menasdika, comelier perchance than my Garina, but sweetly rings Garina's matchless voice. In rapture trance I listen while Garina sings. This is my fair girl garden, sweet they grow, rose, violet, and lilies snow. And which the sweetest is, I do not know. For rosy arms and starry eyes are there, honey sweet voices and cheeks passing fair. And these shall love, I think, remember long, for these shall bloom forever in my song. Well, I think you can see there's nothing explicitly sexual there, but there is, if you know poetry, there are a lot of references there that express this type of love. So that's the Greek background. Moving to Rome, and that becomes a little more important when we get to Christianity, but it followed a similar pattern as the paradigm of that of ancient Greece, but with less man-boy affection, and that's important. When you found this man-boy relationship in Rome, it was generally exploitative. It didn't have this same sort of educational love mentor aspect to it. Roman men were free to enjoy sex with other males without being seen as any loss of masculinity or social status, as long as they took which role? The penetrative role. So this becomes, again, an important distinction between ancient cultures and some of our modern cultures. So, who were their acceptable partners? Slaves, prostitutes, and entertainers. Relations with free boys, that was citizens, was prohibited. So, what I want to point out here is that in Greece, it was much more affirmative sort of relationship. In Rome, it was pretty much exploitative. And that will become important when we look at Paul, what he's complaining about when he's looking at Roman homosexuality. Okay, with the transition to Christianity, 390 AD, the Emperor Theodosius I made homosexuality a legally punishable offense. This is interesting. Initially, for the passive partner. So initially, it's an offense for the passive partner. That's because the role of the masculine here is still seen as more powerful. If you're passive, that means somehow you are giving in to this, and therefore that was punishable initially. But by 588, Justinian then added it to the active partner and warned that such conduct could lead to the destruction of cities and the wrath of God. So by the middle of the 6th century, we find a definite anti-homosexual shift. The classical notion is just nothing is acceptable except heterosexual sex. a reference to same-sex relations among women in Rome, or lesbianism, is found in the writer Lucian. He says, they say there are women like those in Lesbos, masculine looking, but they don't want to give it up for men. I don't know who translated that. It's probably not the best translation. Instead, they consort with women. And Seneca the Elder mentions a husband who killed his wife and her female lover, and implies that that crime was worse than adultery between a male and a female. So same-sex relationship of both sides by this time had really fallen off. So what do you think during the medieval period? Yeah. Homosexuality was condemned and thought to be totally abhorrent. Always related to a story in the Bible. Sodom and Gomorrah, from which sodomy comes. Sodomy, which means anal sex, by the way. We'll see that it's not just gay men that can use this. But in any case, this became the stance, like Sodom and Gomorrah. And the Roman Catholic Church oppressed anyone who was found to be gay or lesbian. Thomas Aquinas, the great Aquinas, argued that sodomy was second only to murder in the ranking of sins. Offenders, both male and female, were fined, flogged, or jailed. So any homosexual activity was definitely, if not in the closet, in the basement. And this was not something that, because any open suggestion could really get you in trouble. Not to mention your soul. That your soul would go to hell. Okay, there's a revival of same-sex activity during the Renaissance. Do you see why that might be? What did the Renaissance held up? What culture? Ancient classical Greece and Rome. It's the refinding of that classical culture. So as a result, especially in Florence and Venice, widespread practice of what we call same-sex love for a fairly large part of the male population, constructed along that classical pattern. But there was also the other side of that. While that was going on, there were the church authorities under the aegis of what were known as officers of the night. What do you think they did? The officers of the night. They sort of went around, they were moral police. They were checking to see if there was any of this activity going on. And a lot of people were brought in for questioning. Leonardo da Vinci, for one. Michelangelo, brought in for questioning. Some were fined, some were beaten. So the Renaissance Venice, and the dual side. There was a lot of homosexual activity going on, but the authorities were always trying to stomp on it. And then there was the moralizing monk by the name of Savonarola. He was a preacher of destruction was coming. And why is destruction coming? Because we're living licentious lives. So this is one of these constant, you find it in the history of Christianity, suddenly there'll be sort of an openness, and then there'll be a reaction. You know, this is licentious. This cannot be. He actually ended up getting executed. But he went a little too far with his self-importance. But anyway, by 1532, so we're moving forward, in the 16th century, the Holy Roman Empire made sodomy punishable by death. Sodomy is now punishable by death. And then in the year 1533, in England, King Henry VIII passed the Buggery Act. Buggery is another term that's used for homosexuality, making all male-male sexual activity in England punishable by death. And it remained a capital offense in England and Wales with the punishment of death until 1861. Then it was only reduced to penal servitude. Only in 1967 did the UK Parliament repeal the Buggery laws for England. So they lasted essentially from 1533 to 1967. Now, the 19th century did see a rising defense of homosexuality. Between 1864 and 1880, a German jurist by the name of Karl Heinrich Ulrich published a series of 12 tracts, which he collectively titled Research on the Riddle of Man-Manly Love. And in 1867, he became the first proclaimed homosexual to speak out publicly in defense of homosexuality. Whatever side you're on, that took some courage. When he pleaded at the Congress of German Jurists in Munich for a resolution urging the repeal of anti-homosexual laws. That was 1867. Then in 1896, a book is written by a man by the name of Havelock Ellis called Sexual Inversion, which challenged the theories that homosexuality was abnormal. This is an important book. It's one of the first to say that homosexuality is not abnormal, and the various stereotypes about it are incorrect. And he insisted on the ubiquity of homosexuality with intellectual and artistic achievement. Then there was Magnus Hirschfeld's Scientific Humanitarian Committee. And it campaigned from 1897 to 1993 against anti-sodomy laws in Germany. And then there was Edward Carpenter in Britain in 1894, who began writing a series of pro-homosexual articles and pamphlets. So we're seeing a little bit of a sway in the 19th century to hope, some people hope there would be an acceptance. These developments, however, hit some major setbacks. You ever heard of Oscar Wilde? Famed playwright, convicted of gross indecency in the United Kingdom. The lurid details of the trial led to a movement back towards feelings of anti-homosexuality. I think there's a good movie out about that. I forget the title of it, but yeah, he had to serve time in prison. It broke him. It broke him. 1980 in the United States until 1962, all 50 states criminalized same-sex sexual activity. 1962, every state, it was illegal. It was a criminal act. And up until 1973, it was considered mental illness by psychiatrists. Up until 1973. In 1986, the US Supreme Court reviewed a Georgia case that criminalized same-sex behavior and decided that the state's law was constitutional. 1986. They concluded a state has the constitutional authority to criminalize what it considered to be immoral behavior. That was 1986. A major event that took place in this country that really set the gay movement moving. It's funny how sometimes just one event will set something just spiraling. And that's something called the Stonewall Uprising. Has anyone heard of the Stonewall riots? This was a series of spontaneous demonstrations by members of the gay community in response to a police raid that began early hours, June 28, 1969, at the Stonewall Inn, which is in Greenwich Village in New York City. Patrons of the Stonewall and other village lesbian and gay bars, and this was a gay neighborhood. There were gay neighborhoods, but they were always hidden, and they were always being constantly raided by the police. And it wasn't unusual, but one night the police came in, really roughhoused some of the people in the bar, and it exploded. Suddenly, the entire neighborhood was out violently pushing the police back and responding. And they're considered a watershed event in the transformation of the gay liberation movement. By the summer of 1970, groups in at least 8 American cities were sufficiently organized to schedule simultaneous events every year commemorating these riots. Then it spread around the world. So this one event, it was like things were, it's like the water boiling. It's, for a long time, it's sort of heating up, and then it gets to a point and it boils. And this boiled over, and this is where you get what you call aggressive gay activists. Their sort of tone isn't, we're not going to hide anymore. We're not going to let you push us around anymore. We're going to, some of the language, they were upset and angry. And I'm not talking about young gay men. I'm talking about gay men of all ages, gay women, lesbians of all ages, just saying enough is enough. We're not going to take it anymore. In any case, so New York saw the emergence of the Gay Activist Alliance, and similar groups spread around the country and around the world. Then there was the lesbian group known as the Lavender Menace. I like that. The Lavender Menace. And they were formed. And they were formed in response to the male domination of the gay movement. So even these movements begin to fractionalize a little bit. And then the Black Panthers get involved. Remember Huey P. Newton? He expressed public support for the gay. Now, this is important. This is important in terms of the Black community. I've taught in Black communities, and Black communities tend to be some of the most homophobic communities in at least this country. That's for a variety of reasons. So here's Huey Newton, a Black Panther, saying to his people, whatever your personal opinions and your insecurities about homosexuality and the various liberation movements among homosexuals and women, we should try to unite with them. We know that homosexuality is a fact that exists, and we must understand it in its purest form. That is, a person should have the freedom to use his body in whatever way he wants. So the Black Panthers joined the movement. Okay, let's move forward. According to the Associated Press, as of the early 2000s, but not too long, sodomy laws remained on the books in 13 states. Sodomy was illegal for everyone, gay and straight. In Alabama, Florida, Idaho, Louisiana, Mississippi, North Carolina, South Carolina, Utah, and Virginia. In addition, Kansas, Missouri, Oklahoma, and Texas criminalized certain forms of private consensual sexual behavior between persons of the same gender, but permitted those if performed by a man and a woman. So some states allowed for sodomy between a male and a female, which means anal sex. And some people say, why would you have anal sex? Can you think of any reason? I'm not going to give any health issues. Also, what about reproduction? It's a form of birth control. It's a form of birth control. So, during the first half of 2003, Supreme Court, this is important, studied the constitutionality of sodomy legislation. So all this legislation that was taking place in the various states, the Supreme Court took a look at it. In the case Lawrence versus Texas, they reviewed a Texas law that criminalized certain sexual behavior by same-sex couples, even though the same activities were legal if done by opposite-sex couples. In their groundbreaking decision, the court decided, June 26, 2003, that adults are free to engage in private consensual sex without government oppression. That was 2003. They thereby placed limits on the ability of state governments to legislate sexual morality. So you see, this falls back into that old problem of states' rights versus the federal government. Today, 15 states, mainly in the South, either have not yet formally repealed their laws against sexual activity among consenting adults, or have not revised them to meet the Lawrence versus Texas standard. In other words, they're still on the books. They're still on. Why is that important? I mean, even though the Supreme Court has ruled, so they can't go against the Supreme Court, but they still have it on the books. Why might that be important? If the Supreme Court ever changes its position, which has happened many times in a variety of issues with the Supreme Court in this country. So that's still on the books. Today, so let's look at the military now, because this became an issue of late. Prior to 1993, lesbian and gay people were not permitted to serve in the US military. Under the remember the don't ask, don't tell policy enacted that year, 1993, they were permitted to do so only if they did not disclose their sexual orientation, which is kind of strange when you think about it. So you can come in, but we can't know who you are. The Don't Ask, Don't Tell Repeal Act of 2010 permitted homosexual men and women to serve openly in the armed forces. So in 2020, that was repealed. On June 30th, 2016, there was a ban on transgender troops from serving in the military. Remember what transgender is? Transgender is where, well, and probably in this case, a lot of it was transsexual. In other words, these people who had operations to change from one sex to another. And the military was scheduled to complete its adjustment to openly transgender troops by July of 2017. However, that month, President Trump declared in a tweet that transgender people would be prohibited from serving in the military. In November of 2018, the Trump administration formally asked the Supreme Court to issue a ruling on the matter. And on January 22nd, 2019, it granted temporary permission to the administration to proceed with its ban. Temporary. So, as of January 22nd, 2019, transgender people were not allowed in the military. On January 25th, 2021, something's happened by then. What's happened? A new president. The Biden administration revoked the ban through an executive order. So that's the situation as regards the military at the moment. Okay. Transgender people allowed to serve, homosexual, gay, lesbian people allowed to serve. The transgender is a little bit still rocky. Most of the states, however, have kept things on their books, hoping for a change down the line. Let's move to religion. here are some of the Christian denominations that do not view monogamous same relationships as sinful. So these are the people who support same-sex. The United Church of Christ, the Episcopal Church, the Presbyterian Church USA, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. So what about the Methodist Church? And I'm glad I have Reverend Elbert here with me, because I think it's a little more complicated than some people realize. But anyway, in the social principles, there's a book over there. There's a difference between, as I understand it, the Book of Discipline and the social principles, right? They're distinct documents. Social principles, it's stated, although all persons are sexual beings, whether or not they are married, sexual relations are affirmed only within the covenant of monogamous heterosexual marriage. In the Book of Discipline, it states that no church funds are to be given to groups promoting homosexuality. But since Methodists believe their understanding of God's truth is always partial and imperfect, United Methodists are free to disagree with this position. See, in some denominations, the law is the law. You can't disagree with it openly and publicly. You might read, if you just read the Methodist documents, you might say, well, that seems to be the law. But you're free to disagree and disagree. And as a result, the issue has become controversial, especially when we get to marriage, which I'll get to in a moment. So what about some of the other religions? Reformed Judaism views homosexuality to be acceptable on the same basis as heterosexuality. Basically meaning that it's, what would we say, monogamous. I mean, it's not necessarily just in terms of marriage, but it's not promiscuous. They would be opposed to promiscuous anything. So that's how they look at it. How do they deal with some of their scriptures, their past scriptures? They say they're no longer binding, or that they are subject to change that reflect new understandings of human sexuality. These were texts that were thousands of years old, and the Reformed say that they need to be reformed to some degree to meet up, stay up with the times. All the major Islamic schools of jurisprudence disapprove of homosexuality. All the major schools disapprove of it. Although if you know anything about Middle Eastern culture, homosexuality is quite often practiced. But it's not legal, and it can periodically be really a repression. In Iran, for example, whenever the moral police go out, they will go to find homosexuals. And in some cases, they will treat them with great violence. So all the major schools. Now, remember, every religion has its canopy of positions. And there are Muslims who support homosexuality. But I'm talking about the official laws of schools of law, and there's 6 of them. They all oppose it. The Baha'is limit permissible sexual relations to those between a man and a woman in marriage. So the Baha'is oppose homosexuality. Hinduism doesn't have a central authority. There are lots of different sects and groups. And as a result, there are a variety of positions ranging from positive to neutral to antagonistic, which, if you've ever been to India, that sort of summarizes India. You find everything and everything in between. Several of the texts assert that some people are born with either mixed male-female natures or sexually neutral. Some of the texts say that that people are born this way. The third of the 5 Buddhist precepts to refrain from committing sexual misconduct. That's the third precept. However, sexual misconduct is a very broad term and is subjected to interpretation in various cultures and various groups. Generally, Buddhists think that sexuality is a danger, not so much because it's immoral, but because it overly attaches us to the things of life. It becomes the major attachment. And one of the Buddhist goals is to detach. So just in general, those are the basic religious positions. Okay, let's turn to same-sex marriage. Movement to obtain civil rights in same-sex marriage began in the early 1970s. So the start to push towards this. May 17th, 2004, Massachusetts became the first state and the sixth jurisdiction in the world to legalize same-sex marriage. On June 26, 2015, do you remember that date? I was in Cinque Terre, Italy, and we heard it on the radio. I can remember hearing it in the case Oberfell versus Hodges. The Supreme Court ruled that states must license and recognize same-sex marriage. This is an important case. However, 29 state constitutions still include bans. It's another one. The Supreme Court has made a ruling, but there are 29 states that still have bans on their books. They can't be enacted because the Supreme Court's rule. But again, they're hoping for a reversal. Well, what did Pope Francis have to say? He has said that gay individuals are children of God and have a right to a family. You can do something, thereby seeming to support gay civil unions. Other branches of the church, however, remain adamant in their quote-unquote traditional Catholic values. For example, Bishop Thomas Tobin, Diocese of Providence, Rhode Island, stated that Pope Francis's comments are in diametrical opposition to the church's stance on same-sex unions. He said the church cannot support the acceptance of objectively immoral relationships. Individuals with same-sex attraction are beloved children of God and must have their personal human rights and civil rights recognized. However, the legalization of their unions, which seek to simulate holy matrimony, is not admissible. Which, one thing this shows, people think the Pope is infallible. The Pope is only infallible when he makes a statement ex cathedra, which is a statement of doctrine. For example, the Ascension of Mary, or the Immaculate Conception of Mary. Those are infallible. Anything else he says is not infallible. Here's a bishop saying he's wrong. And I think it's a good thing to remember, because just because the Pope states something, he is not infallible. Very highly regarded. His position is no doubt highly regarded, or should be, but not infallible unless he's making a statement. It's called ex cathedra, which is dealing with doctrine. Okay, here's the current position of the United Methodist Church as follows. Although the Supreme Court has made same-sex marriage legal across the United States, the decision as to whether or not to perform a particular wedding is left entirely to church leaders. Since we are a connectional church, no, that's what he's saying. That's sort of read wrong at the moment. That's what the Supreme Court is saying. But this is saying, since we are a connectional church, we are governed on this issue by the rules of the discipline as established by the General Conference. Since those rules stipulate that, quote, ceremonies that celebrate homosexual unions shall not be conducted by our ministers and shall not be conducted in our churches. There will be no gay weddings in our church. So I guess that's the official position, although, again, this has come up for discussion, and maybe at the end you can come in and make some comments, Reverend. Okay, let's turn to now arguments for and against. You have your two lists. We'll go through these, and we'll start with the arguments against same-sex sexuality. Now, like last week, these arguments have largely been taken from a variety of websites, pro and con. Certain degree of repetition in some of them. You probably see those. Some appear more solid than others, at least to me, but that's for you to decide. Okay, arguments against same-sex sexuality. One, it is prohibited or condemned in the Bible. In the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible, there is Leviticus 18:22. Thou shalt not lie with a man as with a woman. It is abomination. And Leviticus 20:13. If a man lies with a male as with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination. They shall be put to death. Their blood is upon them. In the New Testament, there's 1 Corinthians 6:9-11. That's Paul's letters. Know ye not that the unrighteous shall not inherit the kingdom of God? Be not deceived. Neither fornicators, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor arsenokoite. You all know that term. That has been used and traditionally translated as homosexual. We'll get back to that. 2, second argument, it's against the laws of nature. 3, it removes sex from procreation, allows people to treat each other as mere objects for personal pleasure. 4, even if consensual, homosexuality gradually degrades into further sexual dysfunction and devalues human life. 5, it promotes permissiveness, wreaks havoc on the nation's social, political, educational, religious thinking and practice. 6, it is extremely unhealthy and allows for the spread of disease like AIDS, as well as psychological disorders. 8, marriage is a sacred institution supported by religion. For Catholics, it is a sacrament. Gay marriage is not supported by traditional religion. 9, the institution of marriage is essentially in place to assist with procreation and the raising of children. Gay marriage goes against these prerequisites. 10, marriage has always been between a man and a woman, and efforts to legalize same-sex marriage will fundamentally alter the institution for the worse and lead to continual breakdown of the family. In other words, tradition is important. And 11, children need a mom and a dad in order to flourish in life. And same-sex marriage denies children this opportunity of normalcy. Arguments 4. Homosexuality is innate and therefore natural. What does innate mean? From within. It's there. It's natural. It's innate. Some might say it's not even chosen. 2, there is a widespread presence of same-sex sexual behavior in numerous animal species. In any case, what is natural and what is ethical are not necessarily related. Sanitation, science, religion, medicine, reading are not natural. Old Testament passages relate to a time period thousands of years ago when knowledge concerning human sexuality was limited. And if you accept Leviticus 18:22, then you must accept Deuteronomy 21:18-21, which reads, if a man has a stubborn and rebellious son who will not obey the voice of his father or the voice of his mother, and though they chastise him, will not give heed to them, then his father and his mother shall take hold of him, bring him out to the elders of the city at the gate where he lives, And they shall say to the elders of the city, this our son is stubborn and rebellious. He will not obey our voice. He is a glutton and a drunkard. Then all the men of the city shall stone him to death. You see this argument? It's saying if you're going to quote scripture here, you got to accept scripture there. As regards Paul's pronouncement in the New Testament, there is a controversy over what the term arsenokoite actually means or meant. Some scholars say it only applied to temple prostitution. There was a lot of temple prostitution at the time. Young prostitutes, both male and females, were related to certain religious rites. Others say it's the abuse of unwilling young boys. Remember, I think I mentioned the distinction between Rome and Greece. In any case, and this is, remember, coming from a pro position, in any case, unless you're a conservative Christian, Paul's opinions are just that, opinions and not God's mandate. Because remember, everyone who's dealing with gay marriage here isn't Christian necessarily. If you say this to a person who's not religious, they'll say, so what? We don't accept Paul's word, so. 5, sex for pleasure and bonding with another human being without procreation is just as much a part of heterosexual act as sex as homosexual sex. This idea that if there isn't procreation. 6, many heterosexuals are permissive. So permissiveness has nothing to do with sexual orientation, rather with personal character. 7, homosexual sex can also spread disease. Herpes and gonorrhea. About 1 out of every 6 people in the United States has genital herpes. Total number of gonorrhea cases in the U.S. is estimated to be around 820,000. Safe sex is a matter of personal awareness and responsibility. 8, the Convention of Civil Rights and Liberties demands that each individual is entitled to certain fundamental and inalienable rights under the Constitution, including the pursuit of happiness. Such rights should not be denied on the basis of a citizen's sex, race, creed, or sexual preference. In terms of gay marriage, gay relationships are just as loving as sexual relationships. 10, marriage does not necessarily have to be connected with religion, as demonstrated by civil marriages, which are perfectly legal. 11, as to gay marriage not being traditional, if marriage was truly traditional, interracial couples would not be allowed to wed. Marriages would be arranged by parents to share family wealth. In other words, tradition changes. 12, if marriage must be related to procreation, what about straight couples who choose not to have children or are possibly infertile? Should they not be allowed to marry? 13, dozens of studies have shown gay people to be entirely capable of raising children. While it is true that many reputable studies have shown 2-parent families tend to be most beneficial, the gender of the parents has never been shown to matter. And finally, there is no evidence to suggest gay marriage harms society or that it will erode straight marriage. All right, so those are some of the history. Those are most of the basic arguments you'll find. So let's open it up to any questions, discussion. Thankfully, I have Reverend Elbert here to respond to any specifically Methodist questions. So,
okay, now we can see everyone.
Okay. Thoughts, questions?
And those online, if they want to ask a question, just raise your hand.
Okay. Yeah, anybody online, just raise your hand.
Or just unmute.
Jim.
The question I have is, I need to understand is that there's a schism in the Methodist Church, is it fundamentally Methodist churches of the West Coast as opposed to the Midwest and the South, where we think a little bit more progressive and more accepting as opposed to churches in the South? I mean,
I think probably Reverend Albert is better equipped to answer this.
I really can't.
Okay. I'll turn it over to Albert.
Understand that. I mean, there's all one church.
Right.
Why, I guess it's.
So the Methodist Church has always been, it is a connection, it's unique in its structure because it is connectional. However, the doctrines, even though what we call the Book of Discipline is our primary book of law, much of the book of, if you've had a hard time going to sleep and decided to read the Book of Discipline, majority of it has to do with structure, is administrative structures. There's only a small portion of it that is actually doctrinal. And the reason for that is the Methodist Church is not a confessional church, meaning it doesn't have a catechism or a confession of faith. Within the Book of Discipline, there is the social principles and there are the articles of religion. Now, the articles of religion were pretty much adopted from the Church of England, and so we kind of read that as a historical document. The social principles are actually designed it makes it very clear, the social principles cover a whole breadth of topics, and they're designed not to say that all United Methodists are supposed to subscribe to the same beliefs, but they are designed to encourage theological thinking. And it encourages all of us to kind of think deeper about every topic, but leaves open various opinions and thoughts. So one of the characteristics of the Methodist Church is that it has an incredible breadth of theological spectrum. Within that theological spectrum, you have the very conservative, you have the very liberal. In terms of geographically, it's not just the West that tends to be more on the progressive. Yes, the West tend to be a bit more on the progressive, but it's also the North Central and the Northeast. The Northeast, North Central, and the West are three jurisdictions that tend to be more on the progressive leaning. The South Central and the Southeast, typically what is known as the Bible Belt, tend to lean more towards the conservative. In addition to that, the United Methodist Church is global. So we have churches all over the world. We have churches in Asia, we have churches in Africa, and we have churches in Europe. The churches in Africa is probably the fastest growing, and it is incredible. It's we talk about churches being in decline here in the United States. The churches in Africa, that's not the case. It is multiplying multifold constantly. And so whereas the number of Methodists are kind of shrinking in the United States, the churches in Africa tend to be growing. The churches in Africa and Asia tend to be more conservative leaning. The churches in Europe tend to be more progressive leaning. What that says is that we have a huge spectrum. So going back to the question of schism, in recent years, there has been a talk about schism. And the reason for that is, if I can have like 5 minutes to kind of go over a very quick history of this issue of human sexuality. I was just sharing with Beverly before class started. In 1968, the United Methodist Church was formed from the union of two denominations, the Methodist Episcopal Church and the United Brethren Church. The Methodist Episcopal Church was a bit more progressive leaning. The United Brethren tend to be a bit more conservative leaning. When it joined together in 1968, and the United Methodist Church has a general conference every 4 years, we come together, kind of look at the Book of Discipline, and delegates from all over come together to kind of talk about doctrines, beliefs, structure, primarily structure, polity. In 1972, so 4 years after the Union, there was a statement that was put into our Book of Discipline, which was brought in by the United Brethren, that stated the practice of homosexuality is incompatible with the teachings of Jesus Christ. Ever since 1972, this statement has been debated every 4 years and all throughout. If you think about it, 1972, that was 50 years ago. For half a century, this has been debated. It's gone back and forth until a few years ago, in 2016, it got so bad that in our general conference, there were protests from both sides regarding this issue, and it halted a lot of the other work that needed to be done. So in 2016, the General Conference said, you know what, we're going to have a special session just to deal with this issue. So in 2019, a special General Conference was called, and this is what has been on the news for that year. It was all over the news. And of course, it was all over the papers that the United Methodist Church was falling apart. What happened in 2019 is that there were several proposals put in to deal with these disagreements within the United Methodist Church to kind of figure out a way forward. There were 3 proposals put in. One proposal said, we'll stay one church, and every clergy and every local church can decide what to do on their own. The second proposal was called, I forgot the official name for it, but I call it the bucket proposal. Basically, there were a couple buckets. There was a progressive bucket, there was a conservative bucket, and there were the wishy-washy bucket. I don't know. So, and every church could decide which bucket to be a part of. Okay, it kind of meant that the United Methodist Church would kind of have to subdivide. It would still be United Methodist Church, but it would subdivide into these, I think there were 4 buckets. I don't know. Anyhow, and then there was a third proposal that said, no, we're just going to keep it the way it is. It was called the Traditionalist Plan. And it was not only to keep that statement in, leave it in the Book of Discipline, but it was going to enforce it, so that whoever disagreed with that statement would then be prosecuted. During that time, what happened was that, okay, in terms of, again, the United Methodist Church is a very democratic structure. You have delegates all over that come together and they vote. And what happened is that let's say, when the vote came out, it came out 52 to 48 in favor of the traditionalists, primarily because of the South and Africa and Asia. A lot of that, unfortunately, had to do with a lot of political mandering. And it wasn't necessarily theological, it was all about power and money. Since then, of course, we've been trying to figure out what to do. And again, what that proposal said was anyone who disagreed with that statement that homosexuality is incompatible with the teachings of Christ, if any clergy officiated over a same-sex union, or if a church hosted a same-sex marriage, that it was going to be prosecuted. In fact, it was pretty strict, where they basically it wasn't a 3-strikes law, it was a 2-strike law. Basically, the first time a clergy officiated of same-sex union, there would be a very severe slap on the hand. The second time, you were defrocked. So it was immediate, it was severe, and so there was a lot of controversy over that. Well, within a year, so that was 2019, last year, less than a year since that had happened, everything was supposed to once a decision is made, it takes a full year before it becomes takes effect. So in 2020 was when it was supposed to take effect. Before it took effect, basically there was a moratorium on that rule, basically saying there is not going to be any prosecution and there is not going to be any defrocking. Although there were some of the churches in the, or some of the branches in the South kind of did do that. For the most part, the College of Bishops said, no, everything's going to be put on hold for now. And there was talk about, okay, then are we going to then separate due to this? And that is still the conversation that is happening right now. The thing is, there was supposed to be a general conference to deal with this in 2020, May of 2020. Guess what happened in March of 2020? COVID. So it didn't happen in 2020. So all of this discussion just got put on hold, you know, and I don't know, maybe this was a God thing, you know? We just put on hold, and basically this whole discussion of it just kind of got pushed to the side because we have bigger issues right now. People dying, people getting sick, you know? How do we keep people alive? So this is where the church is at right now. Ultimately, sooner or later, there's going to be a general conference, either this year or next year or the year afterwards, and we'll have to deal with this issue. But more and more since then, there has been there have been discussions and groups coming together. And what we kind of know right now is that when you took a survey of all the clergy, including the clergy in Africa and all these, they realize splitting the church doesn't help anyone. There's a small fraction, and what we found out that is that within our United Methodist Church, there's about 5% extreme, I would say there's about 10% extremely conservative who say that they cannot exist in a church that will allow same-sex unions. There's about 5 or 10% extreme progressive who says we cannot be in a church that denies same-sex unions. And then the rest, 90% that says we may lean left or right, but we just want to stay together as be one church. And so what we know is that moving forward, there will be proposals. Probably we may have attritions of the extreme edges, but the church is going to stay together. That's my gut feeling.
Thanks.
All right?
Okay. Well, thanks for coming, and we'll carry on next week. Do you remember what the topic is next week? Let's see, what is it? It's not war, and it's not assisted suicide, so it's whatever is left.
Whatever is left. It's capital punishment.
Capital punishment, yeah. That's a good one. Okay, thanks again.